Welcome to today's video. Today's video is the third part of three-part lecture series. This lecture series is focused on discussion on implementing enterprise solutions. Third part is focused on challenge number 3, which is challenge involved in selecting an enterprise system especially in mid and large size companies. Case study number 3. In this case study, we are going to look at challenges that are faced in selecting an enterprise system. So this case study refers to in a company, US oil and gas company, the same company that I was referring to earlier, but this was in the headquarters in Houston. The company was tracking KPIs for various core and strategic suppliers on different aspects of performance, and these KPIs were being tracked in individual spreadsheets across the company. So company had 3 operating companies with 25 business units in total, and each business unit had multiple categories. A category is a collection of product service lines. For example, a cement would be a product, logistics or transportation would be a service. So a collection of similar product service lines clubbed together and managed by one team is called a category. So each business unit had multiple categories, and each category had multiple strategic suppliers, and each supplier was given set of KPIs, at least 10 KPIs, for which they had to provide data on quarterly basis. Now let's look at the complexity of KPI data that was being collected. So as I said that there were 25 business units, there were 14 categories in each of these business units, and there were 6 suppliers at least per category for which we tracked KPIs. I've simplified the numbers a little bit so that it's easy to calculate. So the number of spreadsheets circulated per quarter was 25 times 14 times 6. That's 2100 spreadsheets being circulated around. Each of those spreadsheets had at least 10 KPIs. So each spreadsheet would go to a supplier for them to fill out the performance data. So about 21,000 pieces of data was being collected every quarter. And at least in every supplier's case, right, at least there would be 2 reps that would be involved. One would be filling the data and another would be approving the data. So there were about 4,200 supplier folks were involved. Each category, assuming there was only one analyst, sometimes there were more than one analyst per category, but even if you assume one per category, there were 350 analysts who were circulating 2100 spreadsheet and collecting 21,000 pieces of data every quarter. And these same analysts, once they got the data, they would actually analyze the data, do performance benchmarking among the business units, among the suppliers, and create trend reports and highlight, lowlight reports, and all that from the data, and they would share those with the category leads and category managers. So about 700 of those folks were also there, who were the stakeholders, and then there were other stakeholders who were from the business side for each category. And assuming there were 5 per stakeholder per category, there were 1,400 stakeholder involved. So all in all, this slide shows that there was a lot of data being collected, a lot of valuable data being collected with the effort of a lot of people, and a lot of people were involved in this process. When a company is looking to select an enterprise system to implement, there are 2 ways it can go about it. One is it can take an unstructured approach versus a structured approach. In an unstructured approach, the approach is very simple. Somebody decides that there is a requirement for enterprise system. They will ask the supply chain department or IT department to go out and look for the options that are available in the market. 3 demos would be scheduled. Team would like one, and they will implement the system. This is how it works. This is how the unstructured approach works. So we'll see in the next slide what happens when this kind of approach is followed. An unstructured approach towards selecting an enterprise system may be okay in small companies, but if you think about it, small companies don't usually implement enterprise systems. It's usually the mid-sized companies. When the companies have grown to a certain level, they start thinking in terms of enterprise systems like ERP system, procure to pay system, contracts management system. So these systems only come into play when the companies have grown to a certain size. But when they have grown to a certain size, they already have multiple departments, multiple stakeholders that have a stake in the system. So if an unstructured approach is taken, it usually results in a lot of unhappy customers because they are not involved during the requirement phase or during the finalization of the decision phase. The customers, the internal customers and the stakeholders, they are not happy. Also, when the system is already in place, it's way too late, like we saw in our case study with the NGO. The processes were not correctly transformed to match the ERP system, and this results in all sorts of problems. And so departments don't really give their buy-in, and they have really this animosity towards the change at that moment. And it also becomes, once the problem is already there and they are not made part of the solution, it becomes it's not my problem. I didn't create this problem. I'm not going to help solve it. And these are good companies making bad decisions by taking unstructured approach. What would a structured approach look like? In a structured approach, you will start with gathering the requirements. But even before you can gather requirements, you need to know who to talk to find the requirements. And that is done during the stakeholder identification phase. That is the most important phase for your project, is to identify the right stakeholders. And there is a way to do that too, and if we have time permit, I can go in depth about how to do that. But understanding who are your key stakeholders is the most important step you can have in any enterprise system implementation. Once you have identified the right stakeholders, engage those stakeholders, have one-on-one interviews, and then document those outcomes of the interviews and make sure that they are shared back with the stakeholders to further refine their inputs. Once you have the inputs of all the stakeholders, that will go into formulating a matrix that you will call a selection matrix. It will have the criteria that are really important to your organization, to your stakeholders in selecting the enterprise system. Once you have that criteria defined, then you will take that criteria and put it into your RFI or RFP template in order to ask your suppliers specific questions to find answers, to understand how each of these suppliers score against those criteria. And I will share a template with you in a little bit to understand this point better. So once you have sent this RFX template and you get a response back from your suppliers against and there is an answer against each of the questions that you asked, you score each of the suppliers on each of the answers that they have given on individual basis, and then find an average to those scores and come up with a score for each of the supplier against each of the criterion that was part of the selection matrix. Whoever scores, the suppliers, whoever are in the top 1, 2, or 3 bracket, you will take those suppliers and you will shortlist them, and you will further refine those questions to the suppliers. And once you have this shortlist, you will also go back to your stakeholders that you have engaged early on, to give them an update, to see if they have any inputs. You can also make them part of the demos of these selected suppliers, and have their contribution in refining the requirements. You have actually figured out who would be your final supplier. Do communicate that to your stakeholders, get their buy-in and approval as required, and then implement the system. Once you have implemented it, then definitely train the stakeholders and provide support. Let's look at the selection metrics that we used in the project for selecting a vendor for providing supplier performance management system. So we had 5 suppliers that we shortlisted. Those are listed on the top in columns. And then before we went out to market and look at this search for these suppliers, after we had done the requirement gathering from our stakeholders, we came up with the different criteria that were important to our stakeholders. So we had 7 criteria that we came up with, and we assigned different weights depending on what the team and stakeholders thought very important for the enterprise. Once we had these criteria, we had the weights, and we had shortlisted the suppliers, that's when we were ready to send it so that's when we were ready to create an RFX that we would send to our suppliers. So in the next tab, I will show you an example of the RFX. So the RFX would look like something to begin with, would look like this, where we would expand on each of the criteria with questions that would help us judge the supplier's performance features that we had listed out. So once we have these questions and we have the suppliers, then we can send this RFX without the scores, of course, to our vendors to fill out, to give the answers to these questions, right? And once we get the answers back, that is when we will start scoring them. We had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 team members. I was one of the team members there. So we would score, each of the team members would take each of the suppliers' responses, we'll read those and we'll attend the demos of the suppliers, and then we'll score them individually on each of the questions, and then aggregate them up to each of the criterion, and then we'll have a final score of for each of the suppliers. And that's how we came up with the best supplier. As you can see, in this case, BizNet was the highest scoring supplier. That is the one we went with. Key takeaway from this case study around selecting this right solution is, in order to identify a right solution for your mid-size or large-size enterprise, you do need to identify and engage the right stakeholders. That is the key to getting it right. And then from there on, you have to follow a very structured approach of going about selecting the supplier and engaging the stakeholders. So we are in the last leg of this presentation today. Let's summarize what we have learned today. We discussed challenges around processes in the case study 1A and 1B. Then we looked at the challenges that we encountered around data in case study 2. And in case study 3, we looked at the challenge that we face, that mid-size and large-size companies face when selecting the enterprise solution provider. All these challenges can be overcome if you follow a very structured approach. And that means you follow a certain process of project management, and it starts with having the right team members in the team. And that is the most important thing. If you have the right people who understand the enterprise system, who understand your current processes, who understand the data, who understand various pieces of the organization, then and people who can marry these things together, right? The system, processes, data, everything. You need such kind of people on your team. Those are the right people to have, and then those right people have to engage the right stakeholders at the right time in order to ensure that the stakeholders not only provide their inputs to making the right decision in selecting the software, but they also provide input in making process changes. They provide their inputs in migration of the data. These people are you have their buy-in in terms of adopting to new processes and new ways of doing things within new enterprise system. So that is it for today. You have been a lovely audience. Thank you for listening.